And I'm going to kick us off because there is a question that came from one of our Zoom participants. Hello out there in Zoom land, Maggie Murdoch, good friend of the humanities.
Oh, I know Maggie. Yeah. Soft brag.
Amazing. Maggie asks, I'm just going to read the whole thing, and I believe it's a general question to the panel, so you can choose who answers. Maggie writes, can any of the presenters talk a bit about the prevalence, especially among conservative politicians and media, of using inflammatory adjectives, inflammatory language throughout every communication? For example, one just can't reference the Biden administration, but feel the need to say radical left socialist Biden administration. I get regular communications from the Wyoming governor's office and our lone U.S. representative full of such language. I understand the reasons why such inflammatory language may be used, but I have these questions. What does this mean for effective political communication for everyday citizens? How can it be combated? How might we as citizens encourage a more civil dialogue from our elected representatives? So that is for our panel. And please and thank you. A reminder, panelists, when you answer into the microphone so the folks on Zoom can hear. And when you here in the audience have a question, I will walk to you with your with a microphone, and please ask your question to the panel into the microphone.
All right, well, thank you for that question, Maggie. And if I followed all of that, I guess my response would be yes, you can't avoid it, especially because it kind of goes back to that principle I talked about towards the end of my presentation, which is segmented audience capture. Because you live in the state of Wyoming, you are much more like you're the one going to get communiques from Representative Hageman or from Governor Gordon about the radical socialist Biden administration, how it wants to destroy the state of Wyoming and America at large. And I guess with regards to how we can challenge that, the problem is the way you framed it as a primarily conservative issue, you only experience it as a conservative issue because you live in Wyoming. This is an everybody issue. This goes back to this, like our media landscape encourages inflammatory language. It doesn't, there's no room for nuance because nuance does not get clicks. And with regards to how to combat that, this is going to sound like a bit of a cop-out. You just have to be a more critical consumer of that. You make, I think in that case, then, especially if you are living in a place like Wyoming, where you're very much steeped in one political culture, you have to make the conscious effort to kind of branch out, expand your horizons, especially online, follow as many different voices as you can, and then be sure to be conscious about bringing all of those perspectives into forming your own opinions and encouraging that kind of productive dialogue with everyone in your immediate vicinity.
I think to hit on the what do you do about it, the first thing that my mind went to is voting. And also telling your representatives that you're upset with them from the local level all the way to the national level. The national level might not read them, but that doesn't really matter. But especially the local elections, if you write a letter to them and say, hey, this inflammatory language that you used really upset me, and I'm considering, I'm in this district, I've been a registered voter in this district for this many years, and this is what I don't like about that. I think that would go a lot farther. I'm seeing a representative shaking her head. It goes a lot farther than you think.
I just want to say too, I think related to John's presentation about the far right taking over, there has always been moments throughout our political history where the far right figures out a way to corner the market on language. And to the extent that the left is not as willing to be offensive, we find ourselves in this conundrum of, we want to talk about democratic ideals. We talk about things in language that is not necessarily as much of a hook, but so we're sort of facing that down as well. Is there's a degree in that kind of language of disregard for any kind of common sense of communication.
Not everybody has to answer everything. Because you have questions for our panel, I'm sure.
I have one for Lucas.
Please speak into the microphone so our Zoom folks can hear us.
Yes, for sure. So this is for Lucas. And my question is just about the scope of the Wyoming Elections Project. Just how many ballot line item persons or offices are you planning on putting into this database? Are you going to include judges? Are you going to include county commissioners, auditors? Is it going to be everybody or just a few select offices?
Oh, good question. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning judges. That's something else I have to put on my list. Yeah, it's gonna at the end, which is going to be 40 years from now, so a reasonable timeline. We're going to have as many races as possible. We're going to start with gubernatorial races and eventually even go clear back to territorial governorships as well. Of course, that was mainly appointed, but that's a whole nother story. In any case, the whole idea here, eventually, legislative races, legislative control, congressional races, and just down the line. Eventually, we're going to get as local as possible. I think that would be really cool if you could click on Albany County and see the precincts down in the exact same way to see how the shift has moved. That eventually, but I'm going to need time. And I've already just decided that in about 3 months, I might start a GoFundMe page so people can give me money to do this. I think that would be great, or mainly so I give someone else the money to do it for me, because it's a lot of work to getting this data together. Thank you for that question. It's a very good question.
First of all, I want to thank all the presenters. The programs were all wonderful, informative. I learned some new stuff, and I'm old, so it's always good to learn new stuff. Secondly, I'm with the Laramie League of Women Voters. I've been involved with us for a long time, and the Wyoming League of Women Voters. We're getting ready to do our candidate forums and voter guides that we do every year. I would like to hear from all of you an example of a question that you would like us to ask the candidates. And I'm especially interested to hear what's foremost on your mind as all young people, and you're all young people compared to me. Yeah, everybody's young compared to me. We live long enough, that's what happens. And I'd just like to hear, and it's perfectly, and I'm being selfish because I want to get some ideas on types of questions we can ask. What's foremost on your mind? You're all involved. You're all very informed as to a lot of things going on in Wyoming. And I'm speaking as somebody who grew up in Wyoming. Grew up in this state. We moved here in the 50s. So we've been around a long time, and we have seen the political change in Wyoming, the political shift, very much so over the years. My 91-year-old mother complains about it mightily, that she doesn't know what happened to her state, is what she tells me. It's just everything's shifting. So I will turn the mic back to these folks, and I would just be interested to hear just one question from each of you.
Okay, great. Since I have the microphone, I'm going first. Thank you all. Thanks. Yeah. And thank you for that question too. It's a good panel to ask. All geniuses up here. We could probably come up with something exciting. So for me, my biggest issue is the economy in terms of, I'm going to use the term that I just made up, economic retention. This idea will be not just focusing on the economy of what we're so used to in Wyoming, mineral extraction economy, which is fine. I mean, I come from Campbell County, that's what it is, but I would like to see candidates that are looking a bit farther ahead than just energy. I mean, I live and work in the field of the humanities, and it would be really great to find candidates who like to look at the creative economy also. So that's my vague idea of a question. I hope that helps.
I think I would be interested in hearing what a candidate believes that kind of goes against the very cookie cutter positions of their party? Like what do they believe in that maybe their party doesn't typically stand for, or ways in which they're able to reach across the aisle and work with people that are different from them, ways in which they can find common ground instead of just polarizing people even more.
I guess I am most interested about the limits of what government can actually do and how government can interact with culture at large and the interplay between politics and culture. So I guess I would be very curious to ask candidates how they would see their position as an elected official interacting with non-governmental civic society organizations in fostering a democratic culture at large, beyond and one that extends beyond the ballot box.
As a young person, I think that for a lot of people, especially young people, like education is their first introduction into like political participation. And I think education has become a really big point of contention across the US in terms of like what you're allowed to teach in school and like paying teachers and like how we educate our students. So I would ask them, I don't know, like maybe what their priorities are for our educational system or something like that.
That's a really good question. I think mine is similar to Chelsea's. I want to know what ideas they would take from the other side. Like, what do you respect about your Republican, Democratic colleagues? And what's one thing, if they can come up with it, that they want to work with someone else on the other side on? Sort of get that really specific, tactical answer from them. Because if they can't come up with one, I don't think they're going to be able to do it in office.
So I've had all of these people to think about it, and I still don't know exactly how to formulate what I want to say, but that's living in my brain also. So I think the thing that concerns me as I watch the political landscape right now is the very real threat to human rights across the country, right? We're talking about rollbacks in reproductive freedoms. We're talking about rollbacks in education. We're talking about, perhaps because it wasn't originalist, we can't recognize certain groups and their autonomy. And, and it's sort of a purely self-serving for purely self-serving reasons. Like, I need to know where people sit for real on those issues, not just the things you say for the soundbite, but how are you feeling as you watch this landscape shift?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of piggyback off what Emma said because I'm the second to last and I was also going the route of education. But I think one of the first things I would want to know is what you see your role as relative to the university as a whole. And I'm approaching this from the framework of a lot of programs and a lot of things are being threatened to be defunded. To name a couple, the Gender and Women's Studies Department, anything and everything related to DEI. So what do you see your role and what are those attempts trying to accomplish, I guess? How do you see your role in all that? Are you going to fix that, exacerbate the issue? What exactly is your role in relation to the only four-year institution in the entire state? Because it's the only one. So yeah, that'd be my question. What is your role?
I think I would echo what Chelsea and Dara said, just because going back to what we had in our presentation, it's a lot about finding common ground. Like, we are all trying to do something that we think is good, but how do we go about doing it? That is where I think it starts getting polarized. So finding back to where that common ground is, I think would be a good question to ask.
Thank you.
From a moment ago, Maggie Murdoch says, thank you all for your perspective on my questions.
Thank you.
My question is primarily to Lucas, but it may have implications otherwise. First, thank you for making numbers entertaining. Most people would go out the door when you start talking about numbers. From the discrepancies or the gaps that we saw in the plots that you had, do you sense turmoil? If the divisiveness is that far apart, do you see the divisiveness in your people playing out in these respective counties or across the state?
Good question. Thanks for an easy one. I appreciate it. No, yeah, no, really, all joking aside, I do actually. I see a lot of this turmoil. And that's part of what I'm really hoping to hinge a lot of my paper on in this journal too, is that in 2010, when did this really start getting real bad? But I see this turmoil happening not just between the parties, but even amongst the parties themselves. We have Republicans against Republicans all the time. We have Democrats even rubbing shoulders wrongly with other Democrats. This is happening in several places. And I think a big gap, a big reason for that gap too is that we see a lot of Democrats running away from being a registered Democrat, which is, I think, another reason why we see such a large gap in 2010 forward. Is that Democratic vote share is not only decreasing, but so are just registered numbers. And I think a lot of that has to do with that divisiveness. People are frankly scared. It can be a scary thing. And I'm sure Republicans feel the same way in some more bluer spaces too. I'm not trying to paint this as, oh, woe's me. But just because we're in Wyoming, and that's why I'm using Wyoming context. So I guess in short, absolutely, there's conflict going on. In every county. I mean, but hopefully, yes, there's going to be a silver lining here. Part of the reason for the Wyoming Elections Project is to inspire people to the right action, to bring people back together. And I think by seeing these numbers in this exciting way, your words, not mine, will help to drive people in that direction, ultimately. So ending with a bit of a positive ring, but there's a lot of work to do. This isn't going to be done overnight. Let's not expect to flip houses. Let's not expect to make everyone comfortable with each other in the next cycle or two. It's going to take time because it took time to get this far. So it's going to take time to fix it too. Thank you. That's a good question. I'll pass this on to others if you want to try to tackle the divisiveness question. Are you sure? No, but okay. Sure.
My question is for you two, and I'm sorry I didn't write your names down. But first I want to say thank you so much. I'm a professor and in social work, and coming to things like this make me think about my work differently. So I really appreciate you guys for doing this. My question for you guys is, so I work with people with disabilities, and one way that we control people with disabilities is by restricting information to them. And I was wondering if La Página, if it's just a page, was the newspaper just a page? And have you noticed information restrictions, like if it was more than just a page, in what was put in that one page? What was excluded, I guess?
Sure, that's a tough question because we don't know exactly, what was excluded. We're just at the kind of the beginning stages of this project, and we haven't actually. We're just getting through the Spanish page itself, and we haven't yet had a chance to look at the English side, but it was definitely more than one page. So that, yeah, this was just one Spanish page within a larger English newspaper. So there would be, yes, definitely lots of things that were not included. It wasn't like a translation of the English newspaper to the Spanish. It wasn't. It was kind of like its own little newspaper within the bigger Powell Tribune. So yeah, the stories were different. The focus was different. some of the advertisements might have been the same, but it was definitely for a different purpose and to a different crowd. And like we said, the Betaveleros themselves were encouraged to contribute themselves. And so there were little columns where they could write a little snippet about something, whether it be a marriage, a birth of a child, someone dying, something like that. And so it's very community based. And I don't think that those same announcements would be in the English side, and vice versa. There were probably some in the English side that were not put in the Spanish side. But yeah, it wasn't like a direct translation of each of the Powell Tribune in total. You know what I mean? So I don't know if you want to say anything about I think that your point about the excluding information is really important. And I think Conchita might be able to talk about that.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about La Página, even that is a page or more than one page. We are going to consider it a newspaper because we saw other newspapers in the US similar to La Página en Español, and they were considered newspaper, even though that is inside of the Powell Tribune. I think it has as Chelsea said, it has independence by itself because it was completely different. It was nothing, different news for a different people, for the Betaveleros. Actually, I'm sure there was some censorship or something going on in there, but the fact that it was in Spanish and the people who, the editor of the Powell Tribune didn't speak Spanish, so probably they could, and I'm just assuming, I don't know, probably they could say most of what they wanted. And we realized that the tone at the beginning of the page and the tone at the end of the page, it was completely different. It progressed to the Betaveleros didn't feel as encouraged, and they didn't feel as good, and they didn't feel as integrated in the community. So I feel that, yeah, probably there was some exclusion, but maybe not that much. I don't know if we answered.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Not to belabor your position, I was a little bit confused by your deduction or conclusion that it seemed a matter of segregation, that this community, Powell, whatever, decided to publish something in Spanish, as well as the rest of the paper was English. Today, in the few circles that I run in, and they're not academic, that's my community, my church, it's considered a laudable activity to acknowledge it, because it's acknowledgement. It's allowing the other group to be recognized. Yes, they may not speak exactly the same way I do. They may not look exactly the same way I do. Prior to the touchable future, they were just ignored in most cases. That's not what's happening, at least in my circles. And I felt that instead of there being criticism about, maybe it wasn't quite so extensive as the English part of the paper. Maybe there were things that the controlling word really kind of got me. I didn't understand that it wasn't considered a positive thing because the people were allowed expression. They were given recognition. Things were happening. News was circulating for them that would not have otherwise been possible if their families, children, whatever, didn't speak English. So why is it that you felt that was a negative kind of outcome of the effort? Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think what we tried to present was that there were a lot of, positive reasons for this happening and symbols of very positive things such as integration. We said integration, but also segregation. We said that they were being brought into the community, but also the sugar company was using this as a tool to kind of control and manipulate people. I think that the newspaper, since it was being funded by the sugar company, like there was a very definite reason and purpose for this newspaper even being published in the first place. So this was not like a community-based newspaper that was just only being, integrated into the Powell Tribune. This was a project funded by the sugar companies to bring in good workers and maintain those workers throughout the year. They wanted workers that were not just going to be seasonal, but that were going to stay in Powell for the whole year. And so they had a vested interest in kind of attracting and keeping them and making them do what they wanted, which was to be good workers. And that isn't always bad. I mean, that's how capitalism works. Like we want people to be good workers, right? That's how it works. And so we're not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing, but we are acknowledging that there was a part of the paper that was like purposely influencing its readers.
The paper was also a way to tell them how to behave in most of the part, especially how they have to behave in their community. Okay, there were many rules that, look, if you behave like this is going to happen to you. Okay, like kind of patronizing to tell them, if you can live here, but you have to behave. Okay, and I know that all the citizens in Powell, not only these people, had to behave, but the way that this probably, and I don't know if it happened in the English paper, but there were so many rules and so many things that they have to tell them how to do this in a patronizing way. Or for instance, there were lists of these people, the list of the good betabeleros that they were always paired up with the ranchers, like they were part of them, like they couldn't do anything by themselves besides being with the rancher. They didn't have an autonomous identity. They were part of the ranchers. So the thing is that, there was, the newspaper actually within this newspaper is wonderful and we love it. It's the first newspaper in Wyoming in Spanish. It's a wonderful thing. But we see what was going on for these people, that they were second-class citizens in Wyoming. And we cannot forget that it was a good thing, but there was not completely integration.
I think just one quick example is that there was an article about a little girl who passed away, and the article reported on, the little girls, what they had done to try to save the little girl's life. But at the end of the day, she ended up dying. And at the end of the 2 paragraphs, it said, the Spanish-speaking people of Powell should be grateful for the good care that the Anglos gave to the girl's family, period. So that just, it's great that the story is shared about, acknowledging the life of the little girl and the family that was affected by this, but it's kind of framed, like if you just take a little bit of a critical look at what is being said and why, I think it kind of does raise some concerns.
Thank you very much for all the presentation. I learned so much from different point of view. Yeah. And then I kind of have different response and try to connect all these ideas together because in the end, the presentation said I forgot your name, but no solution, only the problems. Yeah. And then we also talk about how this society has constructed that white male property owner. My training is urban planning and have been travel many cities around the world. And I begin to connect so much about how urban planning affects democracy and how they're interrelated to each other. It's also quite related to social welfare about urban planning. And it's interesting that Singapore has a good urban planning, but don't have democracy. Yeah. But I've been traveling around the world. I found that Amsterdam is one of the good examples, have good democracy and also good urban planning. Yeah. But when we go back to the Americas problem, you realize that all this segregation, inequality, actually so much it reflect on right in the beginning, the zoning and the segregation. And they also found the principle of urban planning in America is not sharing. And this is really pay all the problem why the society is so hard to interact with each other, because all the immigrants come in, they are not allowed to integrate it into the major society. And that kind of urban planning principle also quite reflect in a little town like me at this moment. There a lot of ideas, and even I live here for a long time, and I never talked to the neighbors right on the opposite side because they are such a big Trump supporter, and they kind of hate us right in the beginning when I moved into on the opposite side of their house. Yeah, and I think that a lot of time this problem can be solved by kind of doing a better urban planning and better integration of the people. Even for the poor people, if you can do a better design of the community, actually they can save a lot of nice money and also create a lot of mutual support. Also, in terms of environmental aspect, it's also very good for the society. I just try to provide a different aspect about look at how urban planning affect democracy. And I think in America, this is really need a lot of work to do. It's not a perfect democracy, and also tailored for urban planning in terms of social or environmental aspect. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I know of two more questions. I'm going to go here, and there's one more on Zoom too.
Perfect. Well, I'm sorry for forgetting your names too, but the presentation on restorative justice and ecology, and then the one on guardianship, really got my mind kind of trying to connect the two. And so thinking about the torture of the wolf that recently happened in Wyoming, and thinking about restorative justice as bringing the harmed and the person that perpetuated harm together, how would we envision doing that work in a situation where the harmed is an animal, a non-human animal that may not have that agency? And how do we speak on behalf, or how would we do restorative justice? Because I think that our predator management policy will have to be addressed because of the outcry of this. So how do we do restorative justice when the harmed can't speak for themselves?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And I was thinking myself about how we tie restorative justice to something where like the real, like the person or the animal in this case that's harmed, like in certain cases you can't always fully address the harm that was done because, you know, like in that instance the wolf is dead, right? And I sat in on the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission meeting a couple of days ago, whereas it was 2 hours of people, of the public, I should say, addressing the commission about why they're so upset about what happened. And I think that's where the idea of people having like these different perspectives becomes really important because there were hunters who were talking about the reputation that this type of policy gives them. And there's people who care about wildlife. So there was one woman who said that she had driven from South Carolina to speak about this incident. And so I think, and kind of like to what Dara's talking about the idea of people being able to advocate for themselves. In this instance, like the wolf, the one being harmed, couldn't advocate for itself, obviously. So I don't know. I think the idea of people as a community being able to come together and think about like all of the different ways that people can be harmed by like a single action is really important. And I think that's also where the idea of like public engagement becomes really important, because if not everyone's like voice is being heard on a particular issue, then it's like, okay, how do we bring in the voices that aren't being included in a situation? So yeah, I think that instance is like a really good example of like where the gaps are in like public participation. I don't know if that answered the question.
This question wasn't really about my project, but it kind of is. A common misconception in the field of disability studies and social work, we talk about the difference between speaking for people and empowering people to speak for themselves. And in regards to disability studies and guardianship in particular, there is a myth that people with disabilities cannot speak for themselves, and it is a myth. We are just not listening to them, right? And so because they might not follow the same type of communication that we do, we see it with people that don't speak the language, but even people that do speak English, we are not listening to them because we don't speak the same language, but we do. They communicate in the same way that you and I do. You just have to listen to them. So I think in regards to my project, that's something that I've talked to some colleagues of mine about is, you know, the difference between speaking for someone and giving them a space to speak for themselves.
I also, yeah, off of that point, there's this new, some places have kind of moved towards this idea of like, so I think a river in Canada was recently granted personhood, where it like has the same rights as any person to advocate for itself. And it kind of goes back to the idea of like, right, we have all of these like different parts of like our natural environment, like in terms of like ecosystems and wildlife that sure they can't like speak for themselves literally, but as like community members we can still pay attention to like the inherent value that comes with like our natural world. And so it's like approaching these issues and like advocating for each other from this perspective of like being a community where you all rely on each other, whether you're a person or not. So yeah.
Thank you. Emma, would you pass the microphone down that way? I'm going to take one more question and then we'll just rearrange the chairs real quick and then we'll hear from Representative Sherwood. But if you have other things that you want to talk with the panelists about, I'm sure they would be happy to hang out for a little bit at the conclusion of the symposium and talk with you. So one more question, and please and thank you. Keep passing that microphone all the way down to the end. Ha, exactly. Please and thank you. This is a lovely question, and I would love to hear answers from each of you on it. Again, Maggie Murdoch writes, today's presentations and this question and answer session clearly reflect much knowledge, research, and thought. My thanks to all involved for sharing. Could presenters talk briefly about one important thing they have learned from their Democracy Lab work that would be useful for us as citizens to know and perhaps practice?
This is not perhaps something that I've truly learned yet because I can't practice it yet, but I'm still struggling with it. But it's something that Danielle introduces to us, radical empathy. I'm doing my own thesis research, and that's a conclusion that I'm coming to also, and it's just so hard, but it's sorely needed. Danielle, if you want to tell them what it is again when the mic comes to you. we all kind of need that. But that's one of my biggest takeaways. And like, this also comes back to difficult doesn't mean impossible type of thing. It's so hard. It's so hard, but it's not impossible. But getting to that, I'm still learning what it is. I'm still grasping with it, but hopefully soon enough, I will be able to practice it also.
It's a great question, Maggie. Thank you. I'm thinking about this, and I'll tie it back to Anissa and I's project. I think one thing that I've learned and am still struggling to implement, but I will try nonetheless, is that idea we talked about of when you're having those tough conversations with people, not looking for a way to prove them wrong, but actually listening to what they have to say, rephrasing that or summarizing it back to them, and then responding once you know you have a decent understanding of what they're saying. As someone who likes to rebuttal and argue and refute, I want to go into law. Part of that's a lot of that. It's kind of fun, but you have to recognize that that only goes so far. And if you're not even willing to hear out the other person, then what's the point in having the conversation? Because at that point, you're just talking to hear yourself talk. You're not talking to learn or grow or listen. So I think for me, just learning how to be better about not looking to prove them wrong, understanding, and then from there, trying to have that more productive dialogue. So, yeah.
So I think one of the biggest things that certainly has become clear to me and really, I think, solidified over the course of the year is how important it is to ensure that everybody is working from the same definition of a concept. My mom and I were talking about this yesterday, right? Like if I say the word chair, what do you picture with a chair? Everybody is going to think of something different. When we use big concepts like, and none of us are wrong, by the way, like we're all thinking of a chair, none of us are wrong. But when you're thinking about big sort of emotional or political concepts like radical empathy or worldview discrimination or, democracy, all of us operate in a space where we have a working understanding of what those words are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that as we try to coalition build or as we try to create meaningful teaching and learning spaces that everybody's working from the same definition. And until we get to a place where we are talking about what we mean by those words before we talk about those words, the room for conflict sort of perpetuates and increases.
I'm a little baby undergrad student, so I'm really grateful for this experience because it's really shaped the way that I want to go into the rest of my work. And I think my answer is two things. First is that it all starts with relationships. It all starts with other people. That's a value of the social work profession that I think all professions should take, learn a lesson from. Every project that's up here talks about relationships with something, whether it's relationships with land, with people, with numbers, with whatever it is. And so that's where it starts. And that in itself is a super radical act to say, I'm going to focus on this person and I'm going to take the time for people before I move on to finding an answer. And that brings me to my second thing that's the most important that I've learned is that there's not an answer and that multiple things are true at the same time, and critical thinking and decision making is about balancing all of those things at once. And I think often when we're trying to find the answer, it just gets really exclusionary and anti-democratic. So,
yeah, same. All of you guys. I would just say, yeah, the probably the most important thing I've learned is that, like, if you want to make any sort of like positive change in your community, then you have to trust the people around you and trust that they also want to have a strong community. And I feel like that's pretty much what you guys have all said too, is relying on other people is important. Yeah.
All great so far. I think the biggest lesson I've taken away from this entire process is that we are living in a time, in a world, both out here in the real world and especially online, that is constantly telling you to lose yourself. And in a way and the need to actively resist that has never been more clear. And part of that is a kind of relentless approach to self-criticism. I'm not saying like you have to constantly dump on yourself, but just holding yourself to a certain standard where you are willing to constantly reevaluate your situation, reevaluate your beliefs. And part of that includes, it comes back to the topic of satire, a willingness to laugh at yourself. Laughter is ultimately a form of criticism. It's a fun form of criticism, and it's very fun if you get to direct it at others, much less fun if you get to direct it at yourself. But I think that's why it's so important to practice, especially learning to laugh at yourself, because then in that process, you might learn that, hey, I might be in a place, especially with regards to maybe my beliefs or my orientation towards the truth, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And practicing this, as I have tried to cultivate it over the last year, has been incredibly difficult. I'm not saying it's definitely not going to be easy. It's going to make your life kind of a bit damn harder, but it is so worth it. It makes everything just so much more fulfilling, and it will carry out into every other aspect of your life.
After all this month, I can still define, or I don't know what democracy is still. And I think it's because democracy is so many things. And democracy is critical thinking, is empathy, is voting, is all the people, including the betabeleros. So I think I cannot define it, but I can see that democracy is all of this.
A lot of the lessons I think that I was going to mention have already been mentioned. I would just add the importance of not siloing yourself in your own discipline. I think as scholars, we have a tendency to, we're kind of like knowledgeable in one specific area, and we have a tendency to just read papers from other people who study the exact same thing with us, talk with other people at conferences who also study the exact same thing and kind of think the same way that we do. And when you bring other people into the conversation that don't know your topic, don't have those same assumptions or biases that you might, and you kind of discuss something, it really elucidates new information, like, oh, like, yeah, I guess I did have that assumption that everyone just knew what that was, or I did think that everyone just thought the same as me on this. And it really helps you to examine your own beliefs and kind of build bridges with people that might think a little bit differently than you. So being able to explain yourself, listen, be willing to kind of examine your own thoughts and beliefs is something that was brought out during our retreats in particular, which I really appreciated. Scott, thank you.
Oh yeah, okay. Dangerous to have me go last. Right. I'm gonna obviously echo everything, but further, I think we can go further. I don't know. I mean, from a personal perspective, I learned a lot, not just about my own research habits for one, but also just how great information is. But crucially about this program that I really want to, hopefully that everyone has alluded to, I think here, but really for those viewers at home, I really want them to take home from this is the idea of working on individual projects together. We talk a lot about not being siloed, but crucially, it's about perspective, at least for me. I learned a lot about how much I actually created barriers for my own thinking until I started working with the Democracy Lab and everybody here. I'm not saying if it was anybody but you guys, it'd be the same thing, but it's hard to say. I think the format of the Democracy Lab is built for this sort of collaboration, which honestly, I was doubtful at first. I wasn't sure this was going to work as well as it did, and I was proven wrong, gloriously so. It's great. And I have to thank all of you guys for letting me see that, but also, most importantly, creating great pathways for the future, except, of course, for John, and you have no solution. But no. I didn't mean to call you out, of course. The principle is still the same. I just had to say that. So nothing new to add other than thanks, everybody. I had a good time. So thank you.
Thank you all. Please and thank you. A round of applause for our presenters.